Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence with psychiatrist Bernard David Beitman, MD. Dr. Beitman is the founder of the Coincidence Project. The project encourages people like you to tell each other coincidence stories. To learn more about Dr. Beitman's work, put Connecting with Coincidence in your web browser. You'll find his book, his Psychology Today blog, and the interviews from this podcast. And now your host, Bernard Beitman, MD.
Welcome to CC with BB. I am your host, Dr. Bernie Beitman, MD. Now, my research suggests that coincidences are more likely to happen in times of high emotion, life stressors, and need. Psychotherapy patients are usually caught up in high emotion, life stressors, and need. So psychotherapy becomes a context in which coincidences are very likely to happen. Most therapists do not intentionally use coincidences in their work with patients. Today's guest certainly does. Helen Marlo is professor of clinical psychology and chair of the Department of Clinical Psychology at Notre Dame de Namur University, a clinical psychologist, Jungian psychoanalyst. She maintains a private practice in San Mateo, California. She serves also as reviews editor for the Jung journal Culture and Psyche. She recently published the book, The Spiritual Psyche in Psychotherapy, Mysticism, Intersubjectivity, and Psychoanalysis. She also wrote a paper at the core of our discussion today, Synchronicity in Psychotherapy, Unconscious Communication in the Psychotherapeutic Relationship. Welcome to the show again, Helen, but this time we're doing it live and in color, and we can see each other. So welcome to the show.
Good to see you again. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I'm going to start off with a story of mine. And now you're the consultant for me about a psychotherapy synchronicity. And keep in mind, as Helen and I are talking, Helen came up with the idea of synchronicity-informed psychotherapy. And we may be starting something here under that title. A few weeks ago, I interviewed a Danish anthropologist on this show. I became more curious about Denmark and found a cartoon called The Danish Poet. It was pretty funny. In the cartoon, the Danish poet took a boat to visit a Norwegian author named Sigrid Undset, who had written a romantic novel with 3 volumes in it. In 1928, Undset was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. A few days later, one of my patients was telling me how he and his wife had found a good way to share experiences. They were reading together the same 3-volume novel written by Sigrid Undset. He was currently reading the first volume. She was reading the second. So here, my patient and I, each in our own way, had found our way to the same book by a Norwegian author whom I and my Danish anthropologist friend had never heard of before. So Helen, what is this saying about a lot? We say about a lot of things, but what is it saying about my patient and me that we would, in these different ways, run across the same, to us, relatively obscure author?
It's a great question. Well, I can think of your story, in a general way that it's part of a pattern that I've seen happens in synchronicity informed therapy where there's a linking event. And I can't help but think of, a concept in analysis of the third. And I think about this author being a third for you and the patient, and that there's that element of creativity and emergence and what can get created out of the third. So I think of that. That's one of the first thoughts that come to my mind is, what is this linking third? And my impulse, and this is what I've done in these experiences myself in my own life as in the psychotherapy, is to look at what does that third have to offer. So the fact that you would research this writer, the fact that you would research the culture. What is this this Nobel winner? What did he write about or she write about? I'd be looking at that. What are they reading about? How do those themes connect the two of you? And what is it that this thing outside of your relationship per se is coming in, and what does it mean in terms of where the work could go? Is it a unifying symbol of some sort to inform?
That's very good. It's kind of like a commentary on our relationship. And
Yeah,
so we look to Sigrid as what's the message that she has for the two of us working in what we're doing right now.
yeah, exactly.
That's that's like a consultation from someplace, and that's another question. Um, on our relationship. Now, we didn't do what you're talking about, and what you're talking about is really synchronicity informed psychotherapy, where you take the synchronicity as somehow not meaningful to the relationship and try to dig into what Sigrid was trying to say about it. And what I did with this was go, wow, man, this is like shows how connected this guy and me are. That's where I start with this. It's a deep connection, and he also has listened to a lot of my previous radio shows. He likes these conversations, so he'll listen to this one too sometime when it gets out there. So we are connected in other ways that these illustrated, which aren't worth talking about now. But that's where I started. But you're adding a wonderful layer here. So this this idea you have of synchronicity informed psychotherapy, could you tell us more about what you mean by that? You just have, but can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, I think that um, I think that to think of that as a meaningful source of data, a meaningful source of the experience, it's a level of knowledge that I don't think we always tap into. And you know, I'm thinking of that. I don't even know who came up with this. That whole idea of we only use 10% of our brain. I don't know whoever figured that out, but I think of it along those lines of that there are these other ways of knowing and experiencing the world that it can be very easy to get closed off from those. And so I think by synchronicity informed therapy, it's like to think of that as what does this Danish author have to teach me about my work with this patient? What might it mean in the course of our work? Is there anything? Is there a message there? And there's always that tension of um, reading too much into something, or it being, an almost psychotic level um, kind of, it's misappropriated and it's really a more psychotic process. But if we can think of those messages or those forms of knowing and apply the same thoughtful analysis that we would with any other kind of clinical data, I guess that's one way I think of the synchronicity informed therapy. It's so easy to take in as clinicians. We take in the person's development, we take in the relationships they've had, their life experiences, their traumas, all that personal level. We know that that's really important, but it's really easy, I think, to disregard something that's transpersonal or collective or cultural. So I think thinking about that in that line and is one way I think of it. One way I think of it being synchronicity informed. The other way I think is that when we talk about synchronicity, because it can be an inexplicable thing and it can seem, like I said, transpersonal, I think it's very easy to go the whole other way and leave out what's the personal dimension within this transpersonal. So, when you share your story, I'm wondering what personal story is in there as well, because the source of information came from a less personal source. It's from the collective or from the cultural or from the transpersonal, but there's always a personal link. So I think that's another way we look. What I mean by synchronicity informed psychotherapy is finding that personal thread in something that seems beyond the personal.
Yeah, well, part of it was to be able to tell my Danish anthropologist friend that I had found this Norwegian, and she'd never heard of this Norwegian author, and then she's walking along the street a week or two later and sees that same book in a bookstore window. So it had something to do with her and me too, because it was my way of finding out about her.
Yes, that's wonderful. That interconnectedness, right?
Yeah, and you have a story that kind of is like that, Helen. It's a magical story. So why don't you tell us about that one?
Okay, all righty. It's a good story for the idea of synchronicity-informed psychotherapy, because I think, again, it's easy to just think of it as a one-off or something that's amusing or fun. But if we really think about its potential, I think it could take us in a lot of places. And this story emerged in the course of me teaching about these ideas in a class. So my story was, I had been working with a man, I'll call him Mago, a man in his 20s. And he had been in a lot of different psychotherapies that were very productive. They were very effective in his life, for a lot of anxiety and attention problems. He had felt he had a lot of lack of focus, and it was limiting his personal and his professional development. He recently had moved out of his childhood home, and he was just beginning to pursue his college degree in his mid-20s. And he felt as a child, school was not something that had come very easily to him. It wasn't very rewarding. Um, there was a personal dimension to that as well, of not feeling like he could be at school by himself. And so his mother frequently accompanied him in school. He was a very gifted musician, and he was immersed himself in kind of the alternative musical world. But he had a prodigious intellect. He had a lot of intellectual interests in psychology and psychiatry, psychoanalysis, physics, neuroscience, philosophy. Very, very thoughtful in that way, and well read. And he had a real conflict between his academic achievement and this world of music. And he felt that it was hard to, he didn't know that he could integrate these two sides to himself. And so he was really conflicted. Could he integrate this musical side with his sort of burgeoning intellectual side? And, as fate, as the unconscious would have it, you know, he becomes involved in a close relationship with someone whose family really prized the life of the mind, higher education, a very academic family. And so that started to stir this conflict in him even more, given his loving connection with this person and family. So, he was working on that. And the day before this conflict explicitly and consciously entered our analysis, I had been teaching a class about the value of the transcendent in psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy. And I touched on synchronicity, and I played the song "If You Could Read My Mind" by Gordon Lightfoot. I'd always been moved by that song, and there were elements. And then I synchronistically happened to hear an interview where he basically was talking about how the music came from his engagement and in connection with the unconscious. So it's kind of yeah, it was interesting. He said it was as if it was the unconscious writing those words. And so yeah, so I was motivated to play that. I had always loved that song and didn't know that he actually put that together. So I shared that with the class and shared how it can seem like, someone is reading your mind when these things happen. And so we were discussing that. So, the next day I had my patient, and in the previous session, he had been talking kind of about this schism between science and the spirit, and what's considered more valuable in our world, in this intellectual scientific mind versus the spiritual side. And so he was talking, that led to a segue into him talking about the conflict between him being kind of a hardcore rocker and versus the intellectual. And I was seeing him through Zoom, and I was just sitting at my desk listening to him, and I accidentally hit a key on my keyboard, and all of a sudden, in the middle of our session, the song Hotel California by the Eagles comes streaming into my computer between us, and it's streaming loudly between us in the middle of our session. And we started laughing because he was literally talking about him being a rocker versus the intellectual. And so
And that
that,
and that's the question I have for you, because I know that song. We haven't had a wine like that since 1969. I mean, it's definitely an old hippie kind of time that they're referring to. Anybody can leave whenever they want, but nobody can get out. There's a lot of play with that song and words, and I had trouble when I heard your story trying to see how that happened to have meaning for both of you. That it was the intellectual academic thing.
shall I talk about that now, or do you want to hear the
No,
rest of the
no,
story?
no. We're stopping now. We have the rest of the story. I want to hear about. There you were, and I want to make it clear to people listening and watching this, is that you hit the key. Now, you
Yes.
told me another story we're not going to go into once before, where you did something like that and something came into the office. There's another story you told me. So there is a little bit of a trickster going on through Helen Marlo in having all this happen. So you're making it happen. And I love talking about people's responsibility in making stuff happen. But we'll leave that one alone. How did that song get the two of you to laugh? How was that relevant to the intellectual musician thing?
Yeah, sure, sure. Well, I that's a great thing, and I'll have to say, I had to run downstairs in the middle of the session and ask my 17-year-old to fix the problem because I had no idea how I had gotten music out of my computer. She seems to know it in her DNA, and I was like, I'm like, hold on a minute, I'm having technical difficulties, but so I did make it happen, and I didn't even know how I made it happen, right? And to that point. But I think what Hotel California, so just like your example, it it belts out in this, when he's literally talking about being a musician, and we were steeped in this very heady, intellectual dialogue about, and emotional for him about the pain of having this alternative life and not feeling confident in his own academic side and in his own intellectual capacities. And I think it was, the way that I've understood it. Certainly in the moment, the idea of a rock song breaking things up brought an integration into this.
Okay. That was much more basic than the words in the song that you're talking about here. It was just that you were both being so very serious intellectually, because psychotherapy does use a lot of words, not too many songs, not too much music, and that just laughed you up because it was music coming into the intellect so they were happening at the same time. And so it's not the song as much that's important. It's the fact that a great song by the Eagles, very, very well-established classical rocks group, came up and balanced, it seems, the intellectual discussion the two of you were having.
Well, I think that was one part, but you were onto something, and your question was an excellent one. So there was something about it being
Yeah.
Hotel California. So I went ahead and you know did a little research on Hotel California after that happened. And it was really interesting what I learned. So, I think a lot of us think about Hotel California. It's an iconic song. I mean, it has this it's sort of an archetypal song of, like you said, at that time, that hippie time. And, it's, some people look at it as being kind of a song about the American dream, about polarities in our society, about excess and materialism and what's status, what's valued, all of that's in that song. And I think that he has been struggling with that in terms of, being a rocker versus an intellectual, and following his own version of his American dream and what's right for him. And
Yeah,
I,
that's now I get it. It because that song is full of polarities, as I was trying to suggest and what I remembered, and so here you were, a big polarity discussion with him, and the song is polarized. It's yes and no. Maybe yeah, I can get out of here. I can't get out of here. We can have the wine, but we can't have. It's all kinds of polarities in there, and now I get the idea. So let's go on with the rest of the story about this guy.
sure. So then after that happens, okay, so after that happens, the following week, I shared with my students. So I had been giving them a lecture on the transcendent and how synchronicity works. And I shared with them about what happened. So my class is taught on Tuesday, the session is on a Wednesday. Following Tuesday, I share about this to the students. And the students were marveling about it. And one of the students joked and said, Dr. Marlo is magical. And I was amused because I was amused. One student had said, it's like you're magical here. And so they joked about that. And what they didn't know was that 2 days earlier, I had just celebrated my birthday. And it was 2 days before I had given this lecture. And a friend, unbeknownst to my students, had sent me a birthday card. And the birthday card has in big letters, I'll show it to you here, "You are magic."
And I'm looking at the birthday card for those of us, folks, those of you listening. You are magic. All flowers and butterflies hanging around on this card. You are magic. Okay, that was your birthday card. Okay, we got it.
Yeah, so I had gotten that over the weekend. I taught this class on a Tuesday, so I had this birthday card downstairs. So I was teaching this class, and the students started saying, that I am magic. And so I actually recalled back in 2004 at the same university, my students at that time put together a beautiful, beautiful scrapbook for me, and they entitled it Magic Marlo. And so that was back in 2004. There was a possibility that I was going to leave the university, so they put that together for me. I never did, but
I guess we should come up with the loving spoonful saying, "Do you believe in magic?" right now, should we? Or should we just forget about that one? Okay.
I love it. I love Well, I do clearly, and
Yes, you do.
you know, so I kind of, smiled, and I thought about how when you are receptive to and present to the workings of the unconscious, when you can really listen to it, any of us can be magical. We can seem magical. We can feel like magic. So at any rate, I I went ahead and asked the students to wait. I ran downstairs. I grabbed the birthday card that was in my living room and went upstairs, and I showed that to them. And this was like a double synchronicity then to them. They had just told them about the Hotel California, and then I showed them the You Are Magic card. And so again, they were just incredulous about it. So then I brought that card up to my office and I left it there. And the very next day I saw Mago, and my card was sitting on the desk, and he couldn't see it. It was behind the Zoom screen. And I had left it there, and he began the session with, he felt really exciting news. So he told me he had earned all A's in his college courses, and that he was just getting hired for a job that typically would require more education and more experience, which also ties into Hotel California. I can share that with you in a moment in a very literal way. And then he had also booked a gig at a enviable club with another fellow musician. And he says to me, and he says kind of incredulously, he says, "People are beginning to tell me that I'm magic." So I was incredulous, and I break into a huge smile, and he notes the strength of my reaction and wants to know more about it. And I say, "Sure, I can share more, but first let's discuss your feelings and your reactions to people telling you that you're magic." So we began to unpack some of that. We unpacked a lot of the personal dimensions of that. And he shared with me what it meant for him. And he mused how he would always get pulled in so many directions that he could never harness what he felt like the magic in his own life. And he felt like he was experiencing kind of the nascent beginnings of being in an alternative world where he was listening to the flow of this energy. So I shared that I was smiling because I had something wondrous to share with him. And at that moment, I didn't even have to move from the Zoom screen because it was sitting at my desk. I pulled the card out. I show it to him on the screen, just like I showed it to you, that you are magic. And his eyes widen, his jaw drops. And after sitting with the wonder, we just began to explore what that meant. So, at any rate, I began to work with him as to how was that synchronicity functioning in the analysis. What did it have? What meanings did it have? And um, I noted, for example, in reflecting on the synchronicity, it really integrated the sort of magical, non-rational, and seemingly unintellectual world of spirit, but that it was connected through a very academic and intellectual venue, trying to show that they can be together, they can be integrated. It was intimately connected to my teaching as a professor and teaching clinical psychology graduate students in a psychodynamic psychotherapy class. And that was one of the paths that he is debating about. Should he go down this path and go the path of becoming a psychotherapist?
Oh, really? Ah.
Yes. He is looking into, should he go to school to become a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist? And he's really looking at that now. And is that the path he wants to take? And what would happen to his music? So the fact that he was integrated into my academic teaching training world through the course of our therapy, it felt just completely uncanny. And especially given he's looking at what is his future career aspiration.
So the way you're suggesting this works is that the involvement of your class was a commentary for him indirectly, or at least commentary what he might be doing to have for a future for him.
Yes.
So he was even more linked to learning about psychological things through this through the connection you just described.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the third, and the third being like, if this becomes a path for him professionally, then it was linked through my
Yeah.
involvement in that world. So
It's not uncommon for patients who are unsure about where they're going to want to be like the therapist, which means becoming a therapist. I've heard people talk about that often. I don't think they usually do that, but there's this identification with what the therapist doing and appreciation that makes them want to be like you.
right, right. And it felt like this was something that preceded certainly his relationship with me, and it's been something in his own psyche that he couldn't really give voice to because he didn't see himself as having.
That's yet more important.
Yeah.
Well, that I think there's more to this story, but I would like to be able to ask you a few questions that are more general about this synchronicity-informed psychotherapy idea, because it's so important. You've talked about the positive in talking about your patient. Um, let's talk about the shadow side of using synchronicity during psychotherapy. Could you tell us what you think about that?
Yeah, I think that I certainly can't explain or understand all the reasons why these things happen. Ultimately, I mean, we can look at it as an expression of engaging with the unconscious and being attuned to that. But ultimately, there's an irrationality to it. And I think for patients that have a hard time looking at hard reality in their life, looking at more shadow material in their own psyches, looking at painful traumas or wounds, it can be so much more fun to glide away on some fun cosmic synchronicity and not do the hard work of working on our personalities or working on our wounds or our traumas, of building up the ego. And so, I think a lot of times people that have these things um, are almost attuned to another level. Um, People who have these things and get dysregulated, I guess I should say, and a lot of it means they have to sort of strengthen their ego, and that more mundane, slow, painstaking, careful work of building up the ego until people can hold what these things mean and how they could function in their life in a more whole way and not get overrun by it or inflated by it. I think that work takes some time. And sometimes as a psychotherapist, I find that synchronicities happen with certain people very early on in my work with them. And I just have to hold that and not name it explicitly. It's informing me, but I'm not going to show them the card, so to speak, that I showed to this patient. I was able to show this to him because his ego is very well developed. He'd had many, many years of very productive, helpful therapy, but it had never really opened up this wider world, he says. And that's what's been so life-changing to him. He had done really great work with lots of other therapists, and you could see the strength of his ego, and he was functioning well in the world, and he wasn't going to run away with this and have it go into a place of inflation or a place of bypass. I guess those would be the two things.
Yeah, those are two phrases that I want to emphasize. The inflation means, hey, baby, I'm so wonderful. I had this wonderful experience. I'm so special that I can do all this stuff. And this happens to me. And that becomes a form of spiritual bypass. And spiritual bypass isn't clear what that term means until you learn it. Spiritual bypass means going to the spiritual and bypassing the psychological. A good friend of mine for a while was really a great teacher for me about the spiritual, but her ability to work on the regular reality plane was very limited. And she was doing a lot of spiritual work and not psychological work. And what you're suggesting very clearly could happen is that the therapist and the patient get caught up in talking about the synchronicity and avoid the hard work of strengthening their sense of self, their ego.
Yes, exactly.
That's I wasn't expecting that in your answer, but that's right on. I thought there might be some negative things to just doing synchronicity itself, of getting involved in the discussion, aside from the bypassing of the psychological interpersonal, I mean. That's what I thought you might be talking about here, but no, you weren't. Is there any danger in getting into the synchronicities themselves, as besides avoiding this basic interpersonal psychological ego work?
I can't, nothing comes to my mind directly. I think there is a way though that how do you explain, you know, there are some questions about that, and I hold those of when things happen to, where this can go is, why do these things happen to me, or whether they're good things or bad things. And I think there can be a way that to understand something that's so irrational that we can come up with, and sometimes very valid psychological reasons, and then we can lose an empathy and a feeling connection with, to someone who has something that harms them and befalls them. Is that a synchronicity? Is that, how do we understand that dark meaning, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think very grounded empathy and compassion for the human experience. And um, that's the only other piece that I think of when I think about the synchronicities. You think of people who have, I've certainly, people in my life that I've worked with, very terrible things happen. And to not confuse that with the works of synchronicity, and to differentiate that, I guess that's one thing that comes to mind.
One of the problems sometimes with synchronicities that they suggest a decision, but sometimes the trickster is at work, and the decision that the coincidence is suggesting may not be the best thing for that person.
Right, exactly. And I think that is where you have to really explore all the levels of, what does this mean personally, intersubjectively, culturally, transpersonally, all the levels. So
That's there's a lot here, Helen, in your synchronicity-informed psychotherapy. It becomes something, I'd hate to say the word book, but there's a lot of elements to it. And one of them, what are the clinical factors you need to consider when you're doing synchronicity-informed psychotherapy?
it's a great question, because I do think what we were talking about is kind of the shadow of whether it's karma or new age approaches of that primitive kind of way of thinking and being that got so popularized certainly in the 80s and 90s of if you so I think that's something to hold in mind, of being grounded as to not be deterministic about it or causal about it. So that would be one thing I would be thinking about, is looking at its emergence, looking at it more from that lens, and what kind of meaning could be in there, or how could it inform us. I think some of the other clinical factors to think about are not to split off the relational with the spiritual,
Yeah.
non-rational. And I think that frequently happens with people that are more drawn to the spiritually oriented and transpersonally oriented ways of working. So I don't know how to hold something like that without being deeply related to someone. I don't think of it as otherworldly, but because of that otherworldly feel of it, I think we can often lose that human relatedness and lose the human story and go to that. So I would say being able to be well grounded in both of those things. Um, and then, how are they functioning in the world? What is the strength of their ability to integrate a wider way of being and development, and what we might want for our patient, or what we can see that they're capable of, may not be where they are yet developmentally. So being able to hold, stay firmly grounded in development, in the relational, and yet also believe in something larger, and to realize that it might take time to do that. That might not be at the same pace that the synchronicities are happening. So that's where holding that and having it informed, um, having it inform you as the psychotherapist versus necessarily explicitly sharing in some instances.
Yeah, it's I believe the similar idea to the spiritual bypass. You get too caught up in the spiritual and not in the interpersonal psychological. As we come to the end, Helen, there's another element that I think I wonder if what you consider is that some people come into therapy being overwhelmed by lots of coincidences.
Yes.
They're really disturbed because so many seem to be happening and they don't know where they are with them. How do you how do you use that problem in synchronicity informed psychotherapy?
That's a great question. And I usually look at helping them. I usually start by looking at their affect around that. And why is that so disturbing? What does it mean to them that this is happening to them? Oftentimes they can have a place of feeling like, am I losing my mind? Am I crazy? Am I really special here? Do other people experience this? And I think being able to see what's the specific affect, where does it go, that informs me as to their psychological makeup, their intrapsychic kind of functioning, what kind of complexes that they might have that need healing and need to be in better relationship with as a person. So if it goes in, depending on where it goes and how they feel. And then I think that informs me about their interpersonal and their intrapsychic makeup and their relatedness.
That,
That's
that,
always one level. And then the
that,
other level, what's that?
that, that what you said was a lot right there. And you were differentiating between, am I crazy? Am I very special? Do other people feel like that? Those are three things that you right away were asking yourself about that person. And each one of them, answers to each one of them gives you a different direction associated with the emotion they have when they're telling you. And
Yeah.
we don't have time because we have to end, but I think this is for another time. How do those three answers and maybe more inform your direction with patients?
Thank you for bracketing that. That's helpful. I think it informs the kind of work I do in the transference. It informs the kind of relational patterns I'm likely to work with them on. It also helps me in sharing with them that what they're experiencing, people don't always talk about, but that it is a natural process. This is something that we know human beings are capable of. This is not that unusual. And helping them get connected to that and seeing it as a natural human process of that it happens, like you mentioned, in periods of high stress. It also happens, like you said, with high emotion. One of the things Jung added was that it happens when there's an archetype moving. And so an archetype is any common human experience. So oftentimes when there's an archetypal movement in someone's life, then I'm able to frame it in this natural developmental process, human process, and that this seems to be a way that their consciousness is getting on board. And I begin to help them with that what they think is so freaky and weird is not anything to be feared. It's something that we have to learn to relate to. And your mind is learning to relate in a different way. So
That's one of the key messages of a lot of my work with coincidences is, hey, they're not so weird, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of people have them, and I'm still amazed at all my wonderful experiences with synchronicities and coincidences to hear other people having similar ones. I said, how can that be? How can that be? I still like that. I still want to have like very special ones, have my own that are just mine, which I may, but all I know having doing this is that if I experience it, there are some other people experiencing it too. It's one of the fundamental principles of this coincidence analysis, coincidence studies that I'm doing. You ain't the only one, Bernie. You ain't the only one.
yes.
So Helen, we need to wrap our discussion up here. What else? Leave us with some final words from you before we go.
Well, I do feel like we'd be remiss not to name the one fun Hotel California synchronicity that I learned. So I got to tell you this came out of how to work as a synchronicity-informed psychotherapist. So my patient began by the job that he got was in working in a mental health facility, and he was very excited that he landed this job, and that was the day that the You Are Magic. What I learned about Hotel California is that some people believe that it's also a song about a mental hospital. And for me, Hotel California has always been an interesting song about individuation and this idea of with what one grows up with. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. And so if you don't know what's in the hotel, so there's a duality there. So he literally landed a job that week that I showed the card. And so anyway.
That makes a lot. You can check out anytime you want, but you never can leave. It's
Yeah.
like I wondered about that line, and that fits with being incarcerated in a mental health hospital for a long time. That's great. I thought of it as more like regular reality too, but that's another question. So Helen, thank you very, very much for an enlightening discussion of a relatively new idea, synchronicity-informed psychotherapy.
Well, and I do think there is something about you can check out. I do think it's saying a message about that too, that this synchronicity exists. It is part of our human heritage, and we can check out and not believe in it. We can check out and diminish it. We can get inflated with it, but it doesn't ever leave us. And if we can learn to be in good relationship with it.
That's a wonderful way to look at that song and what that phrase means. That's really good. So thank you, Helen. Thank you very much for talking with me.
Thank you for having me today.
You're welcome.
is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.